George R.R. Martin's world can sometimes feel so grand and mysterious, with all the deep histories and intrigues of Westeros. It feels like almost every bloodline and great house, and every Targaryen within the long line of Targaryens has been intricately crafted within his mind. But it's only when you expand beyond that, when you see what lies beyond Westeros, when you see how grand Essos is, that you start to wonder just how much the known world contains. What lies within the mysterious continent of Sothorios to the south, wrought with jungle, disease, and beasts so grand that no settlement has lasted long. With the mysterious, ancient ruined city of Yin that caused an entire settlement to just disappear overnight, and a size so grand that after the Valyrian Jaenara Bellaris explored it for 2 years on Dragonback, she returned and declared it a continent without end. It feels like the world itself is a mystery waiting to be solved, and that what we know is really just the tip of the iceberg. And that's what makes the world building so great. After the initial release of George R.R. Martin's first book in the series, A Game of Thrones, the world building was on a different scale than it is today. His first iteration of the Targaryen bloodline and history, he himself has said, was just him coming up with a bunch of random names and dates that he put at the end of the book.
We know that King Robert had usurped his throne from the Mad King, and before that there had been Aegon the Conqueror and the Targaryen conquest. Well, who are all the kings in between? So I invented a bunch of kings' names and dates, and I put that in the back of the first edition of Game of Thrones.
And it stayed that way through a lot of the initial releases. It wasn't until he got to his Dunk and Egg books in 2013 that he started to run into problems. The Dunk and Egg books, for those of you who don't know, is a set of 3 books taking place 90 years before the main series begins, following the knight Sir Duncan the Tall and his squire.
4 pages for Sir Duncan. He must have been quite a man.
So they say.
But after he started writing, he began facing continuity issues.
And everything was fine there until I wrote the Dunk and Egg story. The first Dunk and Egg story, The Hedge Knight. Elio and Linda looked at the date that was set in and compared it to the date, and they looked at, oh, this guy, you say in The Hedge Knight that this guy is like 35 years old, but that, you know, if you compare it to the dates given in the chronology that you had in book 1, he can't possibly be older than 7. And I went through all these dates and damned if he wasn't right. So I had to change the list of Targaryen kings, and someone who had previously been a son now became a younger brother.
This was the first time since the series' inception that he went back and added depth to the history of the world. But this was just the first. A year later, in 2014, came perhaps the biggest development for A Song of Ice and Fire's world building, a 100,000-word book that served as George R.R. Martin's Silmarillion. Basically a whole book recounting the history and societies of all of the known world, aptly named The World of Ice and Fire, the untold history of Westeros and the Game of Thrones. But this was more than just 100,000 words of world building. You see, in the initial iterations of this book, he wrote a total of 300,000 words, 3 times the size of the released version.
Was that we were supposed to provide them with 50,000 words of text. Elio and Linda, by the time they finished their portion of the thing, provided me with 70,000 words of text, just working on the stuff in there. And then I was supposed to add some sidebars, so I wrote like 300,000 words of sidebars. We wound up actually abridging many of my sidebars, and so what you're saying. So Elio and Linda worked on that, and Anne worked on that, and we got basically the outline of the histories and stuff in there, but not the fully detailed versions that I wrote.
But these extra 200,000 words didn't just go to waste, because in writing that, George R.R. Martin expanded his own understanding of the world, making the world building of A Song of Ice and Fire not just the illusion of an iceberg, but an actual iceberg. If you've ever looked up the Ice and Fire wiki and been dumbfounded by the sheer amount of information that's in there, a large part of that comes from this book. It was also in the process of writing this book that he wrote a lot of the initial history of the Targaryen bloodline, which he then expanded and released in 2018 in the form of the book Fire and Blood, which most people will probably know as the basis for the House of the Dragon TV show. But talking about Fire and Blood, This book really elevates the world building in multiple different ways as well. It recounts the entirety of Targaryen history from when Aegon the Conqueror first came to Westeros and all the way through the Targaryen Civil War Dance of the Dragons. The Civil War being what the TV show is going to adapt. But in the book, it isn't quite written like an ordinary novel. Yes, it's recounted in almost novel-level detail, but it's told from the historical accounts of maesters, septons, other literature sources, and a guy called Mushroom. Reading Fire and Blood is like reading actual historical accounts, with all the unreliability and the bias of the narrators included. It basically forces the reader to play historian and make heads and tails of this story, and this unreliability also adds to the world building. It indirectly tells us about the people who recounts these events, how maesters and septons look upon their history within the world itself. We basically get a glimpse of the fictional historical accounts that are canon to A Song of Ice and Fire. And I'd say that it's this guiding principle that we see on display in Fire and Blood that really makes the world building of A Song of Ice and Fire magical. He makes certain that the people of Westeros don't know everything about their world. Yes, the history communicated could be misleading and will vary depending on the person delivering the information. Oftentimes in other stories, world building can just turn into these occasional info dumps, where some random character just happens to know a lot about the world. And it just so happens to be that in almost all the cases, the information happens to be correct. It doesn't feel delivered by a person, and it doesn't add the uncertainties of the real world. When a character doesn't know something, it isn't always the case that George R.R. Martin will just let them generically go, "Oh, we don't know what happened back then." Sometimes he'll have conflicting accounts and multiple sides to a story with common threads that run between them. He will build the world not through info dumps, but with show don't tell, and will leave the reader to figure out the rest. This principle is also very elegantly shown through the maps of the known world. The known world is just what the people of Westeros know. You can see on the map that Sothorios continues on to the south, and we don't know what the entirety of Ulthos looks like either. And the same goes for Westeros even. The map just cuts off once we reach too far beyond the wall. The people of Westeros simply haven't mapped it out. And although the world building is already one of a kind, we might still get more. George R.R. Martin is planning a sequel to the book The Fire and Blood, continuing the Targaryen history all the way up until the Mad King. Now this is with the caveat that he only plans to write it after he's done with Winds, and who knows how that'll go. But this was just my quick run through of how George R.R. Martin built up his world, and I thought it was interesting to look into. I am planning a full run through of the lore and world building itself as a follow-up to this at some point. You know, where I actually go into what the world itself is in detail. You know, what is the history of Westeros and the Essos and all the great houses, etc, etc. But you guys let me know if that is something you'd be interested in, and let me know what you thought of this video. As always, if you enjoyed, leave a like and subscribe, and join my Discord and come talk to me if you're up for it. And otherwise, I'll see you guys.